Okay, I'll just get started. Thanks for having me, and thanks to John Paul for organising this great conference. This is a joint work with Chiaki Moriguchi and Tonhui Singh. So the motivation for this paper is what historians now call Asia's little divergence. So in economic history, there's a lot of work done on the so-called Great Divergence. So the Great Divergence refers to the gap which grew up after circa 1750 between Western Europe on the one hand and East Asia on the other hand. And this divergence is especially striking given that for the previous kind of millennia, China was probably more developed economically than Europe was. But within the story of a great divergence, there are also stories of so-called little divergences. So one little divergence is between Southern Europe and Northern Europe. In Europe, so rise of England and the Dutch Republic, whereas the centre of economic activity in Europe in the Middle Ages had been Italy. Another little divergence is between China and Japan. So we think this is kind of extremely striking. We also think from a social scientific point of view, the implications of this little divergence are actually understudied. So there's a traditional view about this little divergence. That view attributes tremendous significance to the Meiji Restoration. So that's the kind of revolution which takes place in Japan in 1868, and that's seen as a decisive moment, a critical juncture in Japanese history. And then there's the question, why are similar efforts to reform the state in China less successful? And there's recent research showing that perhaps there's some divergent trends even before the Meiji Restoration, and I'll speak to some of that research. But even taking into account kind of the most recent research, a puzzle remains, and that puzzle is why does the kind of the introduction of what we call geopolitical threats from the West to East Asia, to disrupting the existing East Asian state system, why does that generate differential responses in China and Japan? In particular, China faces disintegration and a century of turmoil and chaos following the Opium War in 1840, but Japan modernizes relatively quickly, and so China looks lackluster in comparison. If you read kind of a traditional historical literature, which we've done in a fair amount of detail, a lot of the arguments are kind of cultural and psychological. Arguments of this type, however, are somewhat dissatisfying to social scientists. So people are saying, the Japanese had better leadership, the Chinese were myopic, or there's a cultural element, and this is kind of anthropomorphism of David Landers, where he's saying China's a reluctant learner, the Japanese are good learners, but none of these explanations seem very satisfactory. And in more recent history, the move of recent historians who kind of don't really agree with these traditional views has been to say, actually, China did a lot. Actually, the Chinese were modernizing, and it's in some sense bad luck that they happened to lose the China-Japan War in 1895. But actually, we don't find this more recent research fully satisfying, as I'll discuss. What we argue instead is that we can provide a political economy framework which rationalizes the choices made by Japanese and Chinese policymakers without recourse to kind of cultural differences. I will say that there is a culture and identity argument which is perhaps a counter-argument to ours, which we're not going to deal with in this paper, but which I'll acknowledge at the end as a potential alternative. But I'm going to focus on a geopolitical story to explain this divergence. Okay, so Western arrival is a shock, it's a disruption, it's a threat, there's a potential of being colonized. On the other hand, it's also an opportunity. So there's new technologies you have access to, new military technologies, new state-making technologies. So it's a threat and an opportunity to learn. In the model I'll discuss, things are going to be driven by the direction and the magnitude of a threat. In particular, there's going to be a distinction between facing a one-sided or two-sided threat geopolitically, and a lot's going to depend upon the size of a territory. In particular, we're going to argue that the compact nature of Japanese geography meant that state building was a necessity when faced by multi-directional threats from Western powers. But once they made the decision to reform and to invest in state building, this was actually fairly feasible because there was a fairly compact territory across which the Japanese state could actually kind of govern, administer territory, raise new taxes, introduce public education, build railroads, etc. Whereas China is a vast territory in comparison, and the external threats, the nature of the external threats they face after 1850 essentially highlight the diseconomies of scale they face. So the response of the Chinese Empire is to decentralize authority to provincial governors, decentralize the fiscal system, decentralize the military system, but this generates a coordination problem. And that coordination problem then impedes any attempts to reform. So one of the facts which we kind of will emphasize is in the 1895 war between China and Japan, there are actually several Chinese armies and navies, and the Japanese only ever engaged the Northern Army and Northern Navy because China had become so decentralized by the 1890s. And had the entire Chinese state mobilized to fight the Japanese, they probably would have had a numerical and logistical advantage. I'll skip the literature slide in terms of because of time. What I will just emphasize is the conventional kind of growing literature on state capacity and modernization is primarily European, so we're adding a new setting for thinking about the rise of kind of modern states and state capacity. Let me establish the stylized facts, which we kind of will need to understand this particular case study. So what we're showing here is the Qing Empire. So the Qing Empire, this is a multi-ethnic empire on a vast scale. So you can see it rules, this is huge parts of Central Asia. But if anything, if you were looking as an outside observer and saying which state is more likely to modernize in 1850, China or Japan, any sensible person probably would have bet on China, right? So the Chinese have a professional civil service. They have a professional national army of circa 2 million men. They have a centralized fiscal system until the 1850s. They have an examination system which recruits professional bureaucrats, which is actually the model of when the English did the civil service reform and introduced examinations for their civil servants in the 1850s. So this is a centralized state. Japan, on the other hand, is split into 260 autonomous domains. The shogunate, the Bakufu, which is the Tokugawa family, who basically, we call Japan in this period the Tokugawa period, and we think of the shogun as the ruler of Japan. The shogun only directly governed 15% of Japanese territory. The remaining daimyo raised their own taxes, had their own armies, had their own currencies, and had their own, in some sense, policies. So Japan has no civil service. The only civil service is in the Bakufu territory, the shogunate's land. They don't have a centralized tax system or a centralized state. So the divergence is even more surprising once you consider how things were in 1850. Now, the argument we're going to make is going to depend a lot on the external threats these two countries are facing. Japan is in isolation in this period. It has no major geopolitical challenges until the Russians, Americans, and British start probing into Japanese waters in the kind of mid-19th century, whereas China has a severe internal threat, at least until the Qing period, from its northern borders. So it can be invaded by the nomads from the north. That's why the Great Wall is there. But until the British arrive in the First Opium War, they don't face another external threat. And so as a result, the way the Chinese state had evolved was to be more focused on the north. So Beijing is located in the north precisely because the emperor needs to be close to the armies on the frontier, which are defending the borders against potential nomadic invasions. And so the Chinese state is centered to the north, even though the economic center is actually further south throughout this period. After 1850, however, or after 1800, the Qing state starts to face different threats. So replacing the Mongols, now you have the Russians. So the Russians are seizing territory in the north part of the Qing Empire, and they're putting pressure on China continuously from the north. But then the British are opening up treaty ports and smuggling opium into China from places like Hong Kong. These treaty ports are also, concessions given to all the Western powers. And then, of course, after, say, 1880, you have a threat from Japan, which eventually results in the occupation, the ceding of Taiwan to Japan. So China is, after 1850, depicted as this kind of lumbering state and kind of in turmoil, beset by external predators. So this is the Chinese dragon, the British lion, the Russian bear, the German eagle. There's even an Italian wolf somehow, and they're all carving open the Chinese dragon. So there's a sense in which these external threats are a massive geopolitical problem for which the pre-modern Chinese state was ill-equipped to deal with. So they could deal with a traditional steppe threat, but they can't deal with being assailed from all directions by various colonial powers. What about Japan? Well, the Japanese story is initially similar. So the Japanese story is that it's illegal for any foreigner to set foot in Japan apart from the Dutch. Christianity is outlawed. There's even cases of Western sailors who were stranded on Japanese waters were supposed to be executed. And basically this is seen as intolerable by the West. And so it's the Americans, Commodore Perry, who first basically, he deliberately sails into Japanese water with a very strong fleet, the so-called black ships, deliberately to impress upon the shogunate that, we're really powerful, you're weak, and the best thing you can do is open yourself up for trade and hope, we're not going to do worse things to you. And so this is a military expedition, but it's designed to impress the Japanese, and it does so, it succeeds. The shogunate very quickly realized that there's nothing they can do to stop the Western powers encroaching on Japan if they want to. So they very rapidly make a series of concessions. They give up tariff rights, they agree to let Westerners settle, and this causes a huge xenophobic backlash. So if you were a Westerner in Japan in the early 1860s, the chances of you being killed by a Japanese samurai for looking at him the wrong way were extremely high. And so this happens to several British businessmen. They basically get their heads chopped off by samurai, and eventually, I'll describe how they retaliate eventually, but eventually they manage to get the Japanese to take seriously the protection of Westerners in Japan, because what happens at first is the Westerners don't follow the right etiquette. They don't make way on the roads, they don't bow correctly, and they end up offending the Japanese grossly. So this is just very amusing, because this is a photograph of Commodore Perry, and this is a Japanese print of how he was perceived. So you can see there's some resemblance, perhaps. So yeah, this is the story I need to explain briefly before we get to the model. So as I said, the shogunate makes these concessions. The shogunate doesn't rule most of Japan, only 15%. And so what happens in particular is there are these more warlike domains in the south, particularly the Chusu domain, which are particularly, for various historical reasons, they're more militarized than some of the other domains. And in those domains, they keep on killing British and American merchants and people. And so what actually happens is the British and Americans actually go to war with the Chusu domain very briefly. It's barely a war, but this is a photo taken by the British after they've captured the Chusu batteries. They do this partly because they try to expel the foreigners, they try to expel the British, and this is after a succession of British merchants have been killed. But the shogunate is not doing this. This is the local domains who are independently trying to take on the West, which of course they can't do. And so this chaos, there's a period of chaos between 1862 and 1868. So the emperor is saying, expel the barbarians. The shogunate is saying, no, we're going to allow the barbarians into trade. And so this is why the daimyo of the Chusu domains defies the shogunate and tries to expel the British, attacks the French shipping. It's a total failure. They have to pay a huge indemnity because obviously they have absolutely no ability to defeat any Western imperial army. And so it's this tension brought about by the Western threat which leads to the collapse of of this Tokugawa regime and to a civil war between the anti-shogunate and pro-shogunate forces, which culminates in the victory of the anti-shogunate forces. They restore the emperor. But immediately, as soon as they take power, they realize that they can't expel the British or the Americans. It's totally unfeasible. The only thing they can do is build a central state strong enough that in the future they might be able to resist Western incursion. So this is just to show but the domains which overthrow the shogunate all come from the south, and together you can see they might be controlling almost as much land as the Tokugawa themselves. So this is the way the Japanese tally the size of their domains by the amount of rice they produce. And you can see that the shogunate is bigger than everyone else, but it's not that much bigger than some of the other large domains put together. And the Satsuma is they're going to rebel in the 1870s, as I'll get to. So, very briefly, I'm condensing a rich history in a very simplified, shortened time frame, so you've got to bear with me. We're coding up different events in Chinese and Japanese history, and the color coding denotes similar events. So in some sense, both China and Japan attempt to reform and build state capacity. Both of them try to implement reforms. Both of them face rebellions. But in Japan, it's successful over a very short period of time. In China, its repeated attempts don't stick. There's backlashes, they fail. The so-called self-strengthening movement doesn't cohere, doesn't last. And it's only really in the early 20th century that serious moves are made to try and reform the Chinese state, and that brings about the collapse of the Qing dynasty. So we're going to try and put together a model which can reconcile some of these observations. So I've said some of this. We've got to account for different pace of reform and different levels of success between these two states. But whilst acknowledging that in many respects things were quite similar. So there was resistance in both China and Japan, yet you find success in Japan and a less success in China. So this is just to illustrate, because one counter-argument to ours would be to say, well, the Japanese were able to do this, but they didn't face resistance of the Chinese. There's a lot of documented resistance in China. The most famous example is where a railroad was actually burnt down and disassembled because it was perceived to be threatening to local elites. But actually that's not really true. There are plenty of rebellions in Japan in the 1870s. The Meiji Restoration is not a one-off event. It inaugurates decades of conflict as the state basically implements these reforms. So this is a revolt, a tax revolt, which is quite substantial. And most famously of all, this is the Satsuma Rebellion. So the Satsuma clan, they're one of the key members of the anti-shogunate coalition, and this is they feel promises were broken, so they rebelled. This is dramatized in a very historically inaccurate film starring Tom Cruise called The Last Samurai, which many of you have seen. We used to have a picture of Tom Cruise up, but the movie is grossly inaccurate, and it massively celebrates, it's unbelievably inaccurate in how it celebrates the samurai, in my view. But you can see here, actually, this is actually quite different as well to the movie, because here, these are the government troops, imperial troops, against the samurai. And you can see that actually, in the contemporary woodcuttings, these are samurai and they're using muskets. And these are imperial troops, and they're fighting with swords. So it's not really how it's depicted in that movie. Another piece of evidence is railway construction. So we're just showing you the actual length of railway. So obviously China is vastly larger than Japan. But in as late as 1913, the total length of railroad construction in Japan was bigger than it was longer. But more railroads were built in Japan than in China, and they were built substantially earlier. And so this is just more evidence for the Japanese embarking on state building earlier. Similarly, the Japanese are fairly successful at introducing primary education in the 1870s. And by the early 20th century, they've succeeded in making everyone go to get public schooling, which is remarkable. You're going from 0 to 100 to 95% in 40 years. Whereas in China, it's only after 1929, it's only in the 30s that you start getting large numbers of people getting basic education. Literacy rates in China in 1912 are about 12%. Okay, so this just illustrates the railroad data. So you can see Japan is always building more railroads than China. Okay, so now we're going to try and have as simple as possible a model to try and get some insights about why state building is difficult. And the key thing is going to be the size of the state. The size of a territory is going to be the key kind of variable in our model. And so this model is building on a previous model we published for answering a different question about why China's unified and why Europe's fragmented. But this model's a little different, so I'll go through it in some detail. We imagine a territory as a line, and the line can vary in length. So you can have a short line or a long line. So you can think about China as having a long line. We're going to simulate the model at some point, and Japan being a short line. Population is distributed uniformly along a line, and they generate taxable income. In the present version of the model, that income is going to just be uniform, and it's going to be like you can get the same amount of tax from any point along the line. We're going to later endogenize this and make this tax capacity variable along the line. You can think about this line as being divided into many territories. So in reality, China was one territory, one government along with this territory in 1850, and Japan was 260. But without loss of generality, we can actually compare the case of two states versus one state, and we're going to get the same qualitative predictions as we would if we had 1 versus 20 or 200. And so the key element of a model is there are going to be external threats along this line, and these threats can enter in from 2 points, either end of the line, so at 0 and at chi. So these external threats depreciate over distance. You can think about these as incursions from Mongols or from the British or other powers. And so this is your border, this is a threat at the border, and over distance t, the threat declines. And in our baseline specification, it's all linear. You can make these functional forms more general. So those are the external threats. What about the state? Well, the state in our kind of simplest models is just building military capacity, although you can think about this as additionally some administrative capacity. And so the state chooses a base, or in some sense a capital, and it spends MC on this is a centralized state, that's why it's denoted by C. It's spending M on the military, but its military power, its ability to project military force declines with distance. So here it's declining linearly with distance t according to a parameter beta. And there's a cost of state building as well, which is quadratic. And so the role of military capacity is it protects the taxpayers from external invasion. So this is an external threat. When these two things are equal, we're saying that territory is protected. So in this example, all of the dotted line is protected from the external threat, whereas this area is damaged by the external threat and unprotected. So then, in order to not collapse and face an internal rebellion, a state has to protect at least delta of this line. So we say there's a revolution constraint that a state will cease to exist if it can't protect at least delta of its line. So if that constraint is satisfied, then you have a revenue term for a centralized state and a revenue term if you have two states, a left and a right state, which is equal to this. So this is just saying you get revenue from all your taxpayers minus the costs of your military, and then also you may lose some, so you're taxing even the area which is damaged in the specification. And so in the left or right regimes get half of this if they're dividing the line up 50-50. So we can now, I'm not going to go through all the propositions in detail. This proposition is just saying that if the threats are low, you don't bother building a military. But if the threats are high enough, then you'll build a military to protect against the specific threats you have. So this is the example of China before 1850. So China before 1850, the only threat they face, they can't be invaded really from the sea, Japan's too far away, no one's coming up from Vietnam to invade China, so the only threat they have is from the steppe, and so they locate most of their military and governmental capacity in the north. This is why Beijing's in the north, to block this one-sided threat. Now we say, what about a two-sided threat? What about if you're threatened from two directions? And so what this proposition says, it says, well, if the threats are low, you just build a state in the center, but you don't invest in military capacity. If the threats are high, and depending on if they're symmetric or asymmetric, you might build a state which blocks either one threat or both. The key point is that it's very costly. If you're small, so this is Japan, where the territory is small, it's not that costly to build a state which has a military capacity to defend against both frontiers. And so you can spend just this amount of M and defend against both threats. But the idea is if you're China and you've got a huge empire to govern, if you wanted to build enough military capacity to defend against both a sea attack or a southern threat, which is like the British, and a northern threat, which is like the Russians, you would actually have to invest a tremendous amount in state capacity, which is perhaps what communist China does after 1949, but imperial China in 1850, it's too costly for them to build this amount of military capacity, given the constraints they face. I might skip this one. This is what happens. Now we're going to look at when you're decentralized, and decentralization is more interesting when you have a two-sided threat. So decentralization is not necessarily two states here, but it's allowing something like feudalism or something like provincial autonomy, which actually is what takes place in China after 1850, when you're saying, look, we're going to allow a local governor to raise his own army. He'll have to raise some taxes to pay for this army. And then he's going to deal with whatever threats in his local area. So this is a response which doesn't make much sense when you're small like Japan, because here you can see it's wasteful because the spending of right military base and the left military base actually overlapping in some sense. It's wasteful for them to do this. But in China, it might make a lot of sense after 1850 to allow provincial autonomy to allow military bases to block both threats respectively. Whereas if you have just a one-sided threat, it never makes sense to have decentralization in this simple model. So this is just the same point that fragmentation is wasteful when you're small, and centralization can be efficient. Whereas if you're big, it's very costly to invest in a central state, and it might be less costly to allow political authority to be divided. Okay, so that's the baseline model. The main thing we use this model for is to say, now, what about the possibility of reform? What about the possibility of state-building reforms, which are going to, in some sense, pay off by raising taxable revenue? So think about this as standardizing the currency or weights and measures, building a modern administrative state, or reorganizing property rights, clarifying land boundaries, suppressing kind of crime and bandits. Well, the way we've chosen to model this is to say, in some sense, you can implement a reform which will increase your taxable income you get from a population from Y to Y hat. But in order for this to be successful, you have to have enough military capacity, kappa, throughout the entire territory for this to work. And so we're now going to show that this is going to be much more feasible in a small territory than as a large territory, and it's particularly the case. It's going to be particularly the case when your small centralized state will want to do this, whereas a large state, which will be decentralized, will be less likely to undertake this reform. So at the moment, we're actually revising this paper. So this is one of the areas of a paper where we're actually thinking of adding some richness, because what I'm showing you right now is quite simple. In particular, we're assuming that you can kind of uniformly raise taxable income if the reform is successful. And we're going to simulate this, and we're going to allow this to be stochastic, like whether the reform works or doesn't work. So to illustrate this with the figures we had previously, the idea is if you're Japan and you've got a centralized state investing a certain amount of military capacity to defend against a two-sided threat, you're almost certainly already above this threshold level of military capacity to allow you to successfully implement the reforms. Whereas if you're China and you've decentralized political authority after 1850, then at the level of military capacity you have to meet your current threats, you might not be able to cover or provide administrative capacity to successfully implement the reform. In order to do so, you would have to either have to increase the military capacity and administrative capacity of these two authorities, of the left authority and the right one, or you'd have to allow new local level provincial governments to emerge, to rise and tax and provide the military and administrative capacity within the country required to implement these reforms. And I should be clear, we're thinking of doing things like suppressing the samurai. That's what the Japanese did. They suppressed the samurai. They suppressed peasant rebellions. They forcibly got every kid into compulsory primary education. So these are massive destabilizing reforms for which there was opposition and against which the Japanese state had to mobilize. So what we do now in the final part of the model is we have a calibration exercise really to show you like under what circumstances this will work and not work. And so these are just the parameter values we assume for China and Japan. So we make China about 9 times bigger than Japan, and we assume they face similar threat levels, and we keep the other parameters the same for both countries. And I'm just depicting this is under decentralization, so we're just depicting the payoffs of one of the Chinese authorities here. There's a more complicated diagram in the paper which you can look at if you want to see that. But what we see here is that when this is the external threat, the capital lander. So when the external threat is low, decentralization is feasible for Japan, and there's no incentive to reform. As the threat increases, then the payoff from being decentralized is always below the payoff from being centralized. And the payoff from reforming, even if that reform is viewed to be less likely to succeed, it's always worthwhile to try to reform, because as you can see, the dotted lines are always above the solid black line. For the Chinese decentralized authority now, centralization is better than decentralization when the threat from the right is low. As this threat increases, however, the payoffs from being decentralized are greater than the payoffs from being centralized, and it's ambiguous whether or not you want to implement reforms, because they could be successful, but the cost of them being less successful is actually greater in expected terms. So this calibration exercise suggests why it was so much more difficult for the Chinese to implement state-building reforms in response to Western threats after 1850. So I have 5 minutes left, or just under. So I'll just briefly discuss some caveats and extensions. So one caveat is we're not saying small is always better. Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, other states were overrun precisely because they were too small. So if you're too small, then even if you build military capacity and build enough state power, you'll still be too weak to resist external invasion. So there's some kind of Goldilocks medium-sized states which find themselves in a better place to implement state-building reforms. We have a lot of generalizations. We can allow local authorities to compete. We can allow more political authorities. But one thing, as I acknowledged earlier, we we're not addressing in this paper. I have some thoughts about it because I think it's actually very interesting and important, which is the idea of national identity. And so one argument is that the Chinese, because they're ruled by a foreign dynasty, the Manchurian Qing dynasty, there was more resistance to reform because of this issues of conflicting ethnicities in China, whereas Japan perhaps had a more coherent sense of national identity. However, when you look at the history, this is it becomes more tricky. Japanese national identity is in many sense the creation of a Meiji state. They didn't necessarily have a sense of national identity in a modern sense before then, and they had a sense, and the Chinese did as well. So saying who has more of a national culture by 1850 is actually a tricky comparison. But I think there is a role for culture and identity here, which we're not going to be able to address in this framework. But we think our story does complement a lot of the other stories out there. So we can think about incorporating role of leaders or different types of or societal attitudes into our framework. So I'll just conclude. We match a lot of observations in East Asian history. I'll just leave it up on I've said a lot of this. We think we can explain why the Qing state tried to reform, but it was trying to reform in an environment where it was also decentralizing. So this is a lot of the evidence which is in the paper, and I don't have time to go into here, where there was local fiscal decentralization, local military decentralization, and attempts to do military modernization, but these are not coordinated. And that's partly why they're not successful. Whereas the Japanese are able to coordinate in a remarkable way, despite being so fragmented before 1868. So I'll just get to conclusion slides. I have all these external validity slides where we try and say, hang on, is our story just tailor-made for Japan, China, or does it explain other cases? And we think we can make the case for it also applying to some other examples. Yeah, another questions, okay. Pink.
I don't think the intuition, it seems to me that from your model, you might think that Japan is too fragmented. They aggregate into a let's say, a medium-sized state. China is too large, so why don't you just get a bunch of Japans lined up in China? So there's for this resistance to external threats, there's a sort of optimum-sized state. Japan gets the optimum-sized state. Why doesn't China get, what would it be, 9 optimum-sized states?
I think there are two aspects to your question. So one is a modeling aspect, which is in some sense what's given in our model is like what's a territory? Like what makes China a territory and Japan a territory? Which I think we can defend in historical terms. The story about why China doesn't fragment more, it does. So there's a quote in our paper where from Mao actually in the 1920s, where Mao of all people actually says China should be multiple states. So there was a sense to this, and during the warlord period, it is multiple states.
So reforms were in the direction, at least, of multiple states, right?
Yeah, they're decentralizing exactly. So they do. That's the point I was going to say. They do decentralize, and the problem is it's precisely that decentralization which then leaves them vulnerable when we come to competing with external powers like the Japanese. So there's a tension between the decentralization you need to meet external threats, but that impedes coordination across states. Similarly, the Chinese are unable to coordinate reforms between different areas. Yang.
So following up, there's a little bit also related to us. So in 1930s, so before that, China was basically totally fragmented. You had world wars around. And then we had this huge threat, unidirectional from Japan.
Yeah.
So then you see the warlords submit their loyalty to some extent to KMT, exactly communist. So I think maybe you can say a little more about this period because this also sheds some light on the model. So it's also applicable to some extent.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think this is the tension we're trying to get at between small is good for some things, but bad for other things, and it's precisely in the China case, the Republican period or the warlord period is now actually seen as a period where a lot of important local state building took place, precisely because it was decentralized. But that left them. I mean, that was why. Had all China been strongly unified under a nationalist government under Chiang Kai-shek, the Japanese never would have invaded in 1937. Yeah.
Have you presented this to anybody who studies Japanese history? I wonder, because I think their head might explode.
My dad's a Japanese historian, and he saw it.
But for example, saying Japan doesn't have a unified government before 1868, so the shogunate can levy taxes. So it's a standard feudal system in which that authority is devolved, right? That they collect however many koku it is.
And they allocate that so they collect the rice, yeah. But it's not. So
it's a classic feudal system, right? And so what happens is the shogunate reforms a little bit, doesn't reform enough. The sort of the sort of outer lord in the south, they rebel, right? And so you have a revolution. So it's a story of like a revolution in the face of an external threat. So to me, the story is why does a military revolution fail in China? Why does it succeed in Japan? What are the circumstances that change in the 1990s that make a revolution to centralize in China later on successful?
So the first point is using the word state to describe a feudal society is actually that's the first issue. Like, do we call a feudal society in Europe in 900 or 1000 a state? They lack many dimensions of statehood. By a Weberian definition of a state, Japan is not a state in 1850. It's a state in some aspects, but not the characteristics by which we call the Weberian definition of a modern state, which is It's past life sovereignty, but that's the inability to coordinate on any. So imagine the Tokugawa shogunate structure had continued. It's impossible to imagine them implementing the series of reforms they implemented in the 1870s. Maintaining the feudal structure they had under the Tokugawa period.
So isn't it something about that leadership fears that they'll lose more, right? So in expectation, I'll lose more by reforming so dramatically. So I have this sort of conservative central government, right? And so you have those on the outside sort of pressing for more reform, and then they eventually, in Japan's case, lead a revolution that succeeds. In China's case, you have the Boxer Rebellion.
So I don't think any of those. So those observations, I'm fine with all of them. I'm not sure if they conflict with my story. The one thing I would say, which is remarkable in the Japanese case, is the extent to which the daimyo who rebel are the most conservative on many dimensions. So it's true they're militarizing, but they're most conservative in terms of expelling the foreigners. And so it's not a classic case of there's a conservative central authority and there's an innovative modernizing rebellion. The ideology of anti kind of shogunate coalition is very conservative, and but once they come to power, they have to reconcile the fact that the only way to survive is to modernize. And so I fully agree that there's some aspect of the Meiji Restoration. Noticeably the speed of it and the speed of a switch in kind of societal expectations, which when you read the history seems, I think, to be very difficult to explain, which is partly why the traditional historiography is actually not particularly satisfying when you read it, because it has to make appeals to kind of mindsets and culture, which are to social scientists only somewhat vague. And we're trying to illuminate those decisions with this political economy framework. But I'd be the first to acknowledge that there's some aspect to it which I still think of as being difficult to explain, like the speed at which they coordinate on modernization is the right thing to do. When you look at other countries, it seems to be much harder to coordinate on those decisions.
Why don't we move to our break?
Sure.
And we can keep
Yeah.
the discussion